Just in time for holiday pieces that call for high fashion flair, we're diving into the art of bias sewing, a technique that brings garments to life with beautiful drape, fluid movement, and that perfect cling we love to see in luxury evening wear.
We'll go over techniques for precision handling, think pinning, stay stitching, and pressing to help you master bias sewing without distorting your fabric. Join us for inspiration and tips to elevate your holiday wardrobe with designs that look and feel timeless. Hello, and welcome to Threaded Together, a podcast that stitches together home sewing and high fashion. We're your hosts. I'm Tracy.
I'm Rebecca, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing all things bias. This is our 23rd episode for Threaded Together, and we are so excited to have you.
We are thrilled to have you back listening to us again.
And of course, don't forget to find us on social media at Threaded Together Podcast. We can see what we're working on and keep up with us between podcasts. Just give us a follow. We're really excited to talk about sewing on the bias today. But before we get into that, Tracy, what have you been working on in this last month?
Oh, I haven't had that much sewing time because I was away and that kept me busy. But I have done a little bit of coat sewing and I hope to spend more time coat sewing as the month closes out. What about you, Rebecca? What have you been up to?
It definitely is the season for sewing. I've been
Definitely.
getting that itch as well. But I've been working on a lot in the past month, but something a little bit different. I did start a weekly series on creating my first full-length fashion collection. So I've been working on that now I'm in the 4th week. I'm documenting that on YouTube, and we'll keep doing that until the end of January. So my response to this question might be a bit repetitive, but at the end, it'll be like, oh, I've made so much. So at this point, I just have made a lot of sketches and swatches, but at some point, there'll actually be garments in there.
How exciting. I'm excited to see the progress you make on that. I'm going to have to tune in to your YouTube series.
So shall we start with what is the bias?
Yes, that's probably the best place to start. If you've been sewing for some time, you'll be familiar with the warp and the weft. The warp is the lengthwise grain, which runs parallel to the selvage, and the weft is the crosswise grain, running from the left to the right between the two selvages. I like to remember it as weft left. If you were to cut a square of fabric and pull it along the warp and pull it along the weft, you'd hear two distinctive different sounds. And now if you were to try and do it again at the 45-degree angle, so along the bias, the true bias, you'd hear a very, very different sound. That's because of the way the threads are and the different properties that those grain lines have. So the true bias is 45 degrees from the straight grain of the fabric. So according to the book, The Bias Cut Dressmaking, a step-by-step guide introduction by Gillian Holman, one often sees a garment described as bias cut. Strictly speaking, this simply means that it is off grain. To hang properly, it is essential that the true bias runs through the center of the panel or through the center front and center back of the garments. And that's something that's really important to remember as you're thinking about bias cut garments. Bias cut dressmaking also suggests that you sometimes see a bias cut garment that doesn't hang properly. And this is where the true bias isn't cut through the center of the panels. And it gives an example of the most obvious case of this being ties, which are on the bias. If the tie spirals as you hold it up, then it's either been stretched when it's been stitched together or it's been cut incorrectly, so slightly off grain.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know about you, Rebecca, but I'm quite tempted to go and check all my husband's ties to see how they hang, whether they hang properly.
My husband doesn't wear ties very often, but I did get a box of dead stock ties to do some sewing with, so I can hang my own ties. This is a scrap project.
So cutting on the bias using that technique allows the fabric to drape softly and really accentuates body lines and curves and making them appear softer, and the fabric doesn't cling, it just hangs and drapes beautifully.
It really does. And the invention of the bias cut by V&A was a reaction to the elimination of corsets in a woman's wardrobe in the early 20th century. Previously, the shape of a woman's garments were dictated by those very rigid understructures. And for the first time, a woman's actual shape was really taken into consideration. At the same time that the bias cut was being pioneered, there was also no access to stretch materials, which makes the discovery of the bias cut not only a fashion revolution, but also an engineering one as well. I think this is a great thing to take a look at as you're kind of pulling to sense the sound, as you had said, Tracy. If you can
Mhm.
just find a square of non-stretch fabric, it's a great test to pull it vertically and pull it horizontally and feel how rigid it is. And then try doing it on the diagonal, and you'll find it suddenly stretches in a really delightful way.
Mhm.
And this discovery by Madame Vianney arguably changed women's fashion forever because it allowed more fitted garments for the first time without needing elastic or underpinnings. Now, a question that I actually had when we were starting to tackle this episode was if in our 21st century world, if using the bias was really necessary, since almost any fabrication can be found with some portion of elastic. And the answer isn't completely straightforward, I would say. In most mainstream fashion, using a bias draped cloth is not necessary since spandex blends make sewing easier, faster, due to all the things that we'll list that must be considered and added in the use of a bias cut garment. They're also cheaper to make, which I think then begs the question of in what case would you want to use the bias? And
Mhm.
there's a couple of answers to that. One might be an aesthetic one. My very old copy of the New Vogue Sewing book purports the value of a checked or plaid fabric used on the bias to not only add a better fit, but also to create a lovely chevron effect, which I really enjoyed. I was like, oh, I need to try that. There's also, as you mentioned, Tracy, the drape and fluidity of a bias drape cloth that can't fully be replicated by an elasticated fabrication. A bias cut garment can also eliminate a lot of seaming, which is one of the reasons why we so often see very minimalistic evening wear for
Mhm.
women cut on the bias. So it's hard to tell in those instances where the wearer's body ends and the dress begins. But when it comes to evening wear and some of these more elevated fabrications, there really isn't anything that can replace the drape of a bias cut garment in those lightweight fabrics without the cumbersome seams. So, yes, choosing to use the bias and choosing to have a bias cut garment is definitely a luxurious one, but the results really are unparalleled.
It really, really does make for a beautiful and striking garment for sure.
Perhaps due to the elevated nature of the fabrics that take advantage of a bias cut, you are very hard pressed to find a couturier or any designer really that doesn't cite Vianney as an influential reference in their work.
Yeah, her work is incredible. And we
Mhm.
did discuss Madeleine Vianney in one of our earlier episodes. I think it was episode 8. And there we talked about how she worked with fabric mills to have these extra wide fabric pieces produced so that she could create these incredible bias cut dresses.
Absolutely. And in American fashion, the bias cut had a massive resurgence in the 1970s due to the rise of Halston. There's a book that I have recently added to my need to purchase list called Halston, an American Original, that details a lot of his designs on the bias. But if you're an avid Pinterest user for fashion history like me, you have probably already seen some of the stills of the designs from the book. I'll add a link to the show notes to a blog post that has some of those photos and talks about that book so that you can see one of the absolutely fabulous designs where the dress is simply made out of a rectangular tube cut on the bias with minimal seaming. I do think there is an important thing to note. To attribute Halston's influence with the bias cut purely to his own genius would overlook a very major known fact that Halston had hired Akira Maki in 1974, a Japanese designer and pattern cutter who is said should be credited with the introduction of the technique to the house. I'll also link an article from Threads magazine on the subject, which has this one line on Mackey's perspective on bias cut garments where it says, quote, that all dressmaking can be regarded as a problem in mathematics. For the curious admirer of his work, this is a boon because Akira can always explain the evolution of his creations in the most logical manner. And I absolutely love that. And this is why it's so much fun to study all of these historical designs, see who learned what from whom, and how they were all brought to life, because so many of Halston's are very almost like puzzle-like in their construction.
That's incredible. What an incredible article as well. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, there are some tips about how to sew the bias correctly, how to handle the edges, how to handle the zips, when to mix it with straight grains, etc. And we want to get into all of those in today's episode.
Absolutely.
So, first of all, your fabric choice. That's really, really important for bias garments. Ideally, you want drapey and fluid woven fabrics like a silk crepe or a satin or a viscose or a challis. You'll find with stiffer and heavier wovens that it won't work as well for a bias garment as they don't drape as well. And we're going to link in our show notes to a Closet Core article where they show the same garment, the Simone slip dress and camisole, in different fabrics, and you can see how it drapes and hangs differently.
Mm.
And in that article, they also demonstrate a hang test where they pin a square of fabric vertically by any of the points and allow it to hang for 24 hours. And here they say, and I'm going to quote, your fabric will either drag or drip, or it will float or lift, to borrow terms coined by Charles Clybacker. And now I also want to link in our show notes. I mean, you've got lots of homework to do. All the show notes links we're linking in today's episode. I want to link into our show notes an article in Threads magazine where David Page Coffin shares tips from Charles Clybacker, the master of the bias, on lessons for working with the bias. And again, there's some really lovely things in there, really great and visuals to see.
I need to read that one too. And I thought something that was so lovely about one of the reasons why you have to hang a garment that's been cut on the bias is because the act of cutting it on the bias will actually twist the yarn. So by hanging it, it lets it untwist a bit, which is why you get it either shortening or lengthening in different ways on different parts of the fabric, which I just thought was so lovely and a great visual of, well, why do you have to do that? But if you think about, you're twisting it a little bit, so you have to give it some time to untwist.
And we can cover a bit more about different techniques to let it hang later. That's the real thing with the bias garment, is that it's going to stretch differently, and that's always got to be aware of. Assuming that you have pre-washed your fabric, the first step is cutting out your fabric, and you don't want your fabric to move around as you cut, and that's really, really important. So use lots of pins, weights, whatever works for you. Use a rotary cutter if it's lightweight fabric, but really importantly, don't let it hang off the edge of your cutting surface, because you don't want your fabric to stretch out before you've even started working on it. So if your cutting out surface isn't quite big enough, fold it over, make sure it's supported. And then another really important thing is that bias cut garments must be cut on a single layer. This is because you want to make sure that your grain line is placed correctly, and if you've got folded fabric, it'll all be skew. So it's really, really important that you cut on a single layer.
I've read too that in addition to lots of pins, you might even want to add a layer of wax paper under your fabric to pin to it before you start cutting out, just to really ensure that nothing slides or stretches as you're cutting.
Yeah, that's a great tip.
Also, when you're cutting a garment on the bias, it's recommended that you take your ruler and measure an exact 45-degree angle from your true grain, and then line that up with the grain line of your pattern piece in order to cut accurately on the bias. And I think you mentioned this as well, Tracy. But if you're uncertain as to exactly where the line is for your true grain, you can always use one of our favorite couturier's techniques of pulling one thread across the top of your fabric and pulling it the entire length, so you see exactly where one straight line is from the top. And then if you measure 90 degrees from that line, you'll get the true grain, and 45 degrees will give you the true bias. But also, having done this technique, both Tracy and I I have. It can be a little bit tricky, but if precision is your goal, a pair of tweezers and some patience will really get you quite far to get it as exact as you can.
Yeah, definitely. And dressmaking rulers have your 45-degree line on them, so they can be a real helpful guide.
By the way, Tracy, that tip came from my Vogue.
I did it.
And I'm just like, wait, this is a book for standard home sewers, and they're telling me that I should basically draw a thread through the
Wow.
top and then measure off of that to make sure it's exactly right. I'm like, who is doing this?
I know.
Who is doing this?
But that's why every fashion course recommends that book, because and the Reader's Digest one as well, because the techniques are completely correct and thorough.
Yes. Insanely thorough.
It would have to be quite a special garment for me to get a tweezers out. I'm going to be quite honest.
Same.
Stay stitching. Okay, so you will know from your own sewing practice that stay stitching is always really important, especially along bias lines like necklines and armholes and so on. So when you're working with a bias garment, stay stitching is really, really important. You have to be careful about how much you handle your pieces before you put your stay stitching on, because you don't want to stretch it out, and you can stay stitch using a straight stitch. And for seams that are supporting the weight of your garment, like the shoulders or your waistline, you can use fusible stay tape on top of the stay stitching, using the straight grain tape for shoulders and the bias cut tape for armholes.
There's also some nuances in bias cut garments when it comes to the actual stitching and layering of your fabric when you're sewing those pieces as well. According to the new Vogue sewing guide, which again is my new favorite reference for all things bias sewing, if you're joining a bias edge to a straight edge when stitching, you should make sure the bias side is facing upward so that you can control how it's stretched along that straight edge and avoid any puckers that might happen if you had the straight edge on top. And then for two bias pieces sewn together, it's recommended you give them a little stretch as they're sewn so that there's more give in the thread on the seams. That way, when the fabric naturally stretches, it won't snap your seams. They also did have a recommendation that when you're sewing two bias seams together, you might want some tearaway wax paper in between. But I think, Tracy, you found that doesn't always help you to have an extra layer of wax paper, not necessarily in this instance, but just add that in case you'd like to, but also probably something you'll want to test on a swatch before you.
Oh yeah, definitely test on a swatch. And in the Closet Core article that I referenced earlier, it suggests, like you say, slightly stretching the seams as you're stitching them to kind of add some stretch to your seam line. Or, and this is very much an or use a very narrow zigzag stitch. And if you do that, you don't want to stretch your seam as you sew because you've already got the stretch in the zigzag itself. Definitely play around with your fabric and your stitches before getting stuck into the garment.
Absolutely. And there is a note in another reference text that I have, which is Sewing for Fashion Designers, that if when you are doing the little bit of stretching with two bias pieces, if it does gather ever so slightly, that's all right. It'll just steam out. No problem.
A good bit of pressing will fix anything.
Absolutely. A couple other just random tips that I came across for sewing bias seam garments included adding a more generous seam allowance than you would when cutting on a straight grain. The recommendation is to bump it up to a 2.5 centimeter, which is more of your couture width rather than 1 centimeter. And also avoid adding anything that would be a straight grain cutout, such as a set-in pocket, which will hang awkwardly and or pull on the fabric.
Okay.
So basically anything that you would cut on a bias, because I was even thinking with like a side of a trouser or something like that, anything that's cut normally on the bias that then would be cut on the straight will throw off the drape of your garment.
Yeah. And if you do use those kind of things, then it's important to use stabilizers as well. So, but often, I think with bias cut garments, probably for your first few, it's worth following some patterns to have the tips and tricks as you work through it.
Definitely.
The book, Bias Cut Blueprints, gives a whole section to distortion of bias cut garments. And it talks about how if you hang a bias cut garment in your wardrobe, how it will completely distort. Gravity can mean that it can stretch out quite a bit. And it talks about how you can navigate around this by storing your garments flat or by weighting the fabric on the true bias before finalizing the hemming.
Hmm.
And so the simplest method for this is to put your garment that needs hemming, so you finished it all but the hem, and putting it onto your dress form and adding some weight to the hem. So they suggest binder clips or snap tape
Hmm.
pinned on and leaving it there for days or even weeks before hemming. But then they also talk about the weighting treatment that Madeleine Vianney used. And again, we'll link to another article, this time where Betty Kirk, who wrote this incredible book on Madeleine Vianney, but where she describes this weighting treatment. Madeleine Vianney used this method where a gridded pattern was basted onto the warp and weft of the fabric before it was cut out, and then it was weighted on the bias using dressmaking weights, hanging the fabric basically to the wall by securing a corner to the wall and then spreading the rest into a flat triangle with the weights attached. And then after it had hung for some time, using the basted lines to realign the fabric for accurate cutting, which seems like a time-consuming but very thorough method to ensure that you've dealt with the way the weight distributes. But I think our big takeaway from that is you must make sure you leave your garment for a little while before hemming it, because it will distort, and that's really important.
If you do need to do a fastening in your
Mhm.
bias cut garment, my Sewing for Fashion Designers book recommends that the best fastening option for bias cut garments is a zip. They recommend hand tacking the zip in place or add a straight grain tape to the seam allowance before sewing the zip to prevent the seam from stretching as you're sewing it, and then you ease the fabric into it. They also recommend that you use bias tape or straight grain tape or interfacing for button fastening options to avoid stretching. And then use rouleau loops for elegant finishings with your buttons if you want to not have to use any stabilization.
And that makes sense, because you think of a bias cut gown with buttons and you do have those beautiful rouleau loops on it. And that makes sense. Yeah, you wouldn't want a buttonhole stretching out.
If you think about, why we use it too, to get that really lightweight drape, and then you have a heavily interfaced buttonhole.
Just hanging straight, completely
Yeah,
flat.
yeah, sometimes that lovely little visual, you're like, "Oh, yes, a nice little rouleau loop would be better suited to that garment."
Lots of the books and articles we've referenced talk about the hemming techniques as well, and suggest that a very, very narrow hem or like a lettuce hem is the best finish for a bias cut garment.
Yep, like if they're rolled, yeah.
Yeah, exactly that. And they also suggest that, obviously depending on your fabric, but sometimes you can leave it completely unfinished because the bias is less likely to fray. But obviously it
Hmm.
depends on your fabric. But yeah, you want something really lightweight for a hem. The best way really to understand the bias is to get stuck into sewing your own bias garment. And don't worry, because we have lots of suggestions for you. The first one I want to suggest is the Tessuti Patterns Evie bias skirt, because this is just a skirt. It's very simple. It's a midi length bias skirt with two views. So you've got one where it's got a bound waistline and side zipper, and the other one is a pull on with like a scalloped elasticated waist. I made a version of this skirt, I want to say like 6 years ago, something like that, in this leopard print. And it's a real staple in my wardrobe because it's so easy to wear, easy to like dress it up, dress it down, and it just hangs beautifully. And obviously in the course of 6 years, my size has fluctuated a little bit, and it all always works. It's just a really, really gorgeous skirt. It's a really lovely pattern.
Yeah. One of the first things I ever made in a bias cut was I was trying to do a lining for a very fitted skirt, and I wanted to be able to move in it. And so it's like initially I had made this very fitted skirt pattern, couldn't move, and then recut it on the bias, and there it was.
Amazing.
It always fits. Yeah.
Yeah. The extra ease you get by cutting it on the bias is incredible. Yeah.
It really is.
So Vogue always has some great patterns for bias items. I just wanted to call out a couple that are on my pin board of ones I want to make.
Mhm.
One is the Vogue skirt V1986, which is this absolutely gorgeous, long, slim fitting bias skirt. It would make some spectacular evening wear. It looks absolutely gorgeous. And then another one is the Vogue dress, which is V2008. And this one is this beautiful evening dress designed by Tom and Linda Platt. And it's got a bias cut halter style, and it's got front neck gathers, and it just, again, a very elegant evening gown.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, that it does look beautiful. Trend patterns, I've got a couple of bias ones for you to look at. One is the bias t-shirt dress, which is a TPC26. And here the pieces are cut on the straight grain. So this is not cutting items out on the bias, but on the straight grain. And then they sit on the body on the bias instead, giving it a very fitted t-shirt look. Bias fit in the body, and then with a fullness and flared silhouette in the skirt. So that's quite a different technique to some of the things we've talked about. And then there's other patterns out there where they have the dresses on the straight, as a dress where the bodice is on the straight grain, but the skirt is on the bias. So you kind of have the flow and drape in the skirt, but the fit through the body. So one of those is the paper cut patterns Lily dress and skirt, and another one is The Cove by Le Pauline. And then a very simple one, if you just wanted a very simple bias cut dress, is the Made by Ray Emerald dress and top. This one has a V-shaped neckline and it's got a curved hem, but it's made up of 4 main panels. You can play around with some of the directions of printed fabrics if you wanted to because you've got that center front seam that gives you different shaping. And there's lots and lots of different patterns out there. And then a couple of the books that we've mentioned in the episode today give you lots of tips on working with the bias and projects that you can have a look at and play around with.
Tracy, we'll make sure to have all of these. I'm not sure if in the show notes, because there's a lot here, maybe in the newsletter with notes. There's a lot of really great ideas, and I've been clicking into some of the links that you'd sent over, Tracy, but we'll make sure that we have all of those in the newsletter so that you can just click through and dream to your heart's content of what you might be making next.
Absolutely. Then I want to just reference a couple of books on bias cut methods that we've talked about and referenced in today's show. But they both include tips on working with the bias and lots of projects that you can do as well. Bias Cut Blueprints, a geometric method for clothing design and construction by Julianne Bramson and Susan Lenahan. This book uses the construction of a bias tube to form the foundation of many of the projects in the book. And you referenced the bias tube when you were talking about Halston earlier. So it's quite interesting to see. And then the other book, Bias Cut Dressmaking, a step-by-step introduction by Gillian Holman, has everything in it from French knickers through to adding bias flounces to skirts through to dresses. Lots of projects and a real variety in there.
To circle back on the 2 books that I mainly referenced today was the new Vogue sewing book, which I think was published in 1980 something. So it's not new at all, but still is one of the most thorough references I've ever seen. And then I do have a book called Sewing for Fashion Designers by Annette Fisher. Generally, I don't find lots of use in that book, unfortunately. It did actually have a great bias section. So I will say for that particular 3 or 4 pages, maybe it's worth looking at. I'll leave that up to you. We'll link it for you. And then speaking of linking, we need to link this back to high fashion. I mean, this is a very high fashion concept, but there's always more to talk about. So there was a viral fashion show that happened last fall by John Galliano for Artisanal Maison Margiela Spring-Summer 2024 that was rooted in a love for V&A and the bias cut. And I think most of us remember this collection, if only because of Pat McGrath's glass skin makeup that took the internet by storm. Tracy, can you picture which collection I'm talking about?
I can picture it completely. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, when they're on the Seine and
Mhm.
it's kind of dimly lit. So, definitely a collection that I think even if you aren't a huge high fashion follower, it's probably something that you did come across at some point. Galliano is very open about his love for V&A, and there are two really interesting applications of the bias cut in this collection. The first is that Galliano used bias cut dresses in lace and other materials to create a seamless, almost body stocking like effect over both a model's bodies, the corsetry they were wearing, and even some with prosthetics. And it's a really interesting use of the bias, considering I mentioned earlier that bias cut garments were developed as a result of corsetry disappearing from fashion. Yet Galliano found an interesting way to kind of reference that and modernize the presentation of that corsetry by using bias cut fabrics that seem to almost be like second skin on the body. And I'll link a really interesting article that discusses that collection in the show notes, because it's worth revisiting that it was the pieces that almost they covered the corset, but they also covered just all of your skin at the same time, and there's no
Mhm.
visible seams, and it's really an incredible effect. There was also an interview with Galliano that was done by System Stories on YouTube that I very fortuitously watched this month, in which Galliano was speaking with fashion students about his design process at Margiela. And when asked who Galliano would want to meet with and ask questions of, he of course answered that it would be V&A, and then went on to recount how for that spring summer 24 collection he had discovered a secret to V&A's technique that he believed had never been written down. He said this after talking about analyzing multiple garments, getting to see them up close at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and having full-scale reproductions. He and his team got to sit around them and then realized that the way she had accomplished an incredible fluidity of embroidery on the bias cut garment in order to make it look, he described as like shimmering water or oil almost, was to not just cut the garment on the bias, but then to embroider on the straight grain. And
Oh,
he shares it with exactly that same sentiment, Tracy, which I think we can all relate to. I'll link to the portion of the video, because it's a pretty long video, where he discovers it, because you can tell he almost is like, should I tell you? I'm not sure I want to tell you, because it was just this discovery that he had made that he felt was so special. And I think we would have all loved to be a fly on the wall while the analyses of these garments was happening. But if he says that it's a brand new insight about V&A that we can all apply to our future designs and creations, I absolutely believe him. So thank you for that, John Galliano. We will now all embroider on the straight grain when we have a bias garment to make it one of those simple yet powerful aha moments that I think we can all appreciate.
oh wow. I know. I just want to go and look at all the pictures of dresses to see that in action. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. At this stage in his career, he's still discovering little nuggets, which I love. And I think just goes to show that designers who, yeah,
Yeah.
they still learn. That's exactly. We all need to just keep learning, but that's also what, you can tell that he just is delighted and loved it. And so inspiring as always. But what are you going to work on next, Tracy? Do you have a bias cut garment in your future?
Oh my goodness, I really want to make one. I feel like I've got all these Christmas outfits I want to make, coats. I've got more sewing than I do time. I'm going to finish the coat I'm working on, and then I'll take stock and see where I'm at. But I think I probably could get away with making one more thing by the end of the year. Time is tight at this point now, but we'll
Absolutely.
see. What about you? What are you going to make next, Rebecca?
Yeah, I've been tempted. Do like a fishtail full length, like floor length skirt, like exactly like that one that you just sent over. I'll definitely take a look at that pattern and see if I can't kind of just wing one on my own. Because again, it's like it should have minimal seaming, right?
Yeah,
In theory.
yeah.
But I think with like a t-shirt in the holidays, like it's very like Jenna Lyons, J. Crew era, but we still kind of love that. So
That's awesome. So our next episode, we want to reflect on the year 2024. Think about what we've made, what we've learned, what we want to make for 25. Just a quick fire Q&A of various things. Perhaps send us your questions if there's anything you want us to answer.
yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a pretty laid back episode that'll air at the end of December. We might
Yeah.
take a look at the schedule and have it air slightly earlier, depending on where the holidays land. But yeah, we're definitely open to any questions. I'll include something in the newsletter if you're a current recipient where you can add anything, but you can always find us on social media. Just shoot us a message and let us know what you love to hear from us in this December reflection episode.
Mm. And before our next episode, if you've got any thoughts, ideas, or questions for us, you can always find us on social media at Threaded Together Podcast. In the meantime, I'm Tracy.
And I'm Rebecca, and this has been
Threaded Together Podcast.
We'll see you next time.
Looking forward to our next episode in a month. Make sure you give us a thumbs up on Apple Podcast or follow us on Spotify. You can find more details on what we discussed today in the show notes below or on threadedtogetherpodcast.com. And for more behind the scenes and regular updates, you can find us on all social media channels at Threaded Together Podcast.